Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm here with Inez. Inez, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Finally, we had the smoke clear out of Manhattan. That was a rough few days where everyone actually had to stay in their tiny apartments.
Oh, well, once again, I am. I win by living in California. I mean, it's all we have fires too, but as far as the natural
Yes, yeah.
disasters go, like
That's not the last time I experienced this kind of smoke was in 2007 in California due to wildfires. So you do not escape
yeah. I
this
think
particular thing.
when I see the hurricanes, like to actually like that's when I get very just like I get very thankful that I live here because to like pack up and move, like I've never had anything. It happens in like the mountains over here, like urban areas. Like I've never seen anyone have to actually move for any reason. Like the ocean is not coming for us. The ocean comes for you on the East Coast and in the Gulf. But I'm glad you're breathing better.
I have the same fears about tornadoes. By the way, that's my like scary natural disaster. As a Californian, I'm totally fine with earthquakes and big storms like hurricanes scare me less just for whatever reason. But the tornadoes are freaky to me.
That's funny. It's like Trump being afraid of sharks. Like you hear those reports where he's like watching Shark Week, like just he's like a TV guy, and it's just like like two people get eaten by sharks a year or something. I think tornadoes are sort of the same way. Yeah. So when we left off last week, like the indictment came literally like 2 hours, an hour or two after we recorded, and I've read the indictment, and I'm sure you've looked at it too. We've seen the reaction to it. What did you think, first of all, about the indictment, about the specifics of it, and sort of where do you see it in our broader the broader culture and the 2024 race?
Yeah, I mean, I think I talked about it in the last podcast. I thought they would go for more the procedural crimes in a hope to actually expedite this kind of thing before the election. They're relying much more on the substance of classified documents and refusing to turn them over, particularly like agency documents, right? So some combination of this is actually they're doing it under the Espionage Act, which is freaking out everybody. But they're doing it under the sort of lesser version, the lesser versions of various crimes. Like obviously, like you could be a spy and be selling American documents to hostile foreign powers, and that's under that act. But then, several layers down is being like the bottom of it is what they ended up talking about with Hillary, right? The reckless standard, where you're just leaving them around. And that seems to literally apply to everybody in Washington, D.C., right? We saw the documents in Joe Biden's, his garage being dutifully watched over by his convertible. And then one layer up is what they're charging Trump with, which is basically like refusing to hand back over documents and then potentially showing them to like other people. But he's not being charged with being a spy. Like just that's the title. Everybody's saying Espionage Act. Look, I mean, I think this is one of those cases where it doesn't really change much. Trump has a remarkable ability to make Rubicon crossing level things seem very LARPy and very like somehow unimportant, because it's always the Trump show and it always comes along with so much sort of drama, and legitimate political sort of fight between Trump and what, to me at least, and you maybe disagree, is a very, very clear, sort of permanent actual rulers in Washington. You can call it the deep state, the administrative state, the blob, whatever you want, that they're very clearly going after him for political reasons. That being said, there's quite a bit in here that he could have easily avoided by being just slightly less Trumpy, like just slightly less irresponsible, knowing that he has this huge target on his back. So, to some extent he has brought this on himself, but at the same time, it's hard to imagine that this blob would not find some way to charge him, right? It was obviously what is it? You show me the man and I'll find you the crime sort of situation. And they're trying to find a way to get him, but this might be the way they get him. This is more serious than the other indictments in the States, in my view.
So you think the indictment is serious? You think it's, I mean, let me ask you, I guess we can go issue by issue. Do you think it's justified? Like, is this something that somebody should be prosecuted for the entirety of the thing? Because the documents he never got charged for the ones he just took. It's just the ones that basically, some of them that he kept after the subpoena. And then a lot of them are obstruction of justice kind of things, perjury. So first of all, is it justified? Is it selective prosecution in your mind? You say, hypothetically, show me the man who committed a crime, but this particular crime, did he actually commit a crime that, it was fair to charge him for given the circumstances?
Well, I guess it depends which way you look at it, right? So is it fair to charge him with a crime that, for example, a lot of people who are like lower level working for the Pentagon would get charged with if they did the same thing? So if you look at it that way, it's not selective prosecution. If you look at similarly placed political figures, it's very clear that they're all doing basically similar things. So they'll try to distinguish this by saying he didn't give certain documents back. Well, Trump's lawyers are going to argue that those were personal records. I think that's going to be a tough argument for them to make in court. Just with regard to some of these things, they're very clearly not, notes the president was making for himself or like little letters he was writing, right? These are, documents that come from the CIA or the FBI or something like that, that are used to brief the president, I assume. So I don't know how far he's going to get, but he's going to say, well, I have a right to these records. I have a right to keep them. I don't have to turn them over. And I'm exercising my prerogative as a former president in doing that. But at the end of the day, look, this never gets charged if they're not going for Trump because they bent over backwards in a pretzel. We have a very analogous case in which there was something actually arguably worse than denying, saying basically I'm not going to give these documents on the basis of a subpoena, which is actually destroying the documents, which they have him on tape talking about, but didn't happen as far as we know, right? We have Hillary actually destroying documents. We have Hillary secretly sending them to an entire server very clearly. And we have her breaking phones, right, to destroy the evidence that she had it. That all screams intent in a way that refusing the subpoena, perhaps also shows some intent. But that's what's going to happen is we're going to indict, you can't have these two standards where one political party, and one set of very powerful political actors gets to do all this stuff. And then indict Trump for it, even if they're both in some level. If we were in the business of charging domestic political opponents for every, potential crime they may have committed, then yeah, I think you could charge Trump, you could charge Hillary, you can charge Biden. The question is, do we want to live in that world? And I think the left has, and more specifically, this sort of, kind of deep state blob, I don't think they've thought at all about the actual political consequences. They think if they charge Trump and put him in jail, that all his supporters are going to evaporate from the country. It's a very naive way of thinking, to my mind.
Well, I mean, a lot of people say, a lot of right-wing people will say, oh, they think it'll actually not evaporate. He'll actually win the nomination and they want to face him in the general election. I don't think it's that. I don't think Jack Smith, do you think Jack Smith is thinking along with it oh, his supporters are going to evaporate if I get him on these document charges?
Look, I don't know what Jack Smith is thinking, but I do think that, the politicals, Biden and so on, I think they think, and I think this has been across the board with media as well. That's why they're so fanatical about quote unquote not platforming Trump. And they were sometimes even during his presidency and when he was running in 2020 and now when he's running in 2024, they talk about quote unquote platforming the president or a major political party candidate as though if they don't cover it, people, I think the way they think about it fundamentally is that people have sort of a watch being spun before their eyes by Donald Trump, the demagogue. And they think that those people will essentially forget or change their minds or quietly go away if they can just get Trump off of the scene, right? They can go back to sort of the what is it, what Obama called it, the coalition of the ascendant. They can go back to their place in the arc of history and they can just continue to do what they have been doing for the last 30 years. And I do think they're somewhat naive about, I do actually think there's a lot of people in the left, they won't say it outright, but the way they behave tells me that they think that if they just could get rid of Donald Trump somehow, that the country would magically be in a better place and it would go back to the way, the sort of direction that it was on before 2016. And I think that that's just fundamentally, just in terms of studying politics, capital P, that's just, it's ludicrous to me. It's very dangerous to think that way.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot to get to there as far as sort of if Trump goes away and sort of what liberals want and why they want it. I mean, there's an interesting question and, different people, take a different approach. But the I mean, I think what happened with this indictment is, yeah, everyone mishandles classified documents. Mike Pence, Joe Biden. Um, as you know, the legal system really does not like it when you don't cooperate with subpoenas. This is like sort of like just the norm that, you get a subpoena, you're under investigation, you cooperate. You could have done a lot of stuff beforehand, but once the legal system is like, it got you in their grasp, you're supposed to just cooperate. That's sort of what the whole system depends on. And look at the indictment. It's really funny. I mean, it's like Trump's lawyers are making voice notes to themselves because like they know or they suspect the things he wants them to do are illegal. He's like, couldn't this disappear? Couldn't we just tell them, there's no, there's nothing. He goes, he misleads his lawyers and has them make false statements to the government. I mean, it's really, really remarkable. And so like this is I think this is clearly in a different class than Pence or Biden. Now, Hillary, we can talk about, maybe being in the same class. I think the defenders of Hillary, well, first of all, let me stop right there and ask you, do you agree that this is beyond Biden or Pence? Maybe that before we talk about Hillary?
No, I think it's not beyond, but I see why. So if you compare it on one particular avenue, it could be worse in the sense that he is defying a subpoena. Right.
Exactly.
But I think there are other ways that makes, for example, the Biden situation worse. Those documents are from when he was a senator. Like senators don't have continuous access to those documents. There's no reason why he should have been able to take them home to begin with. Right. Whereas Trump, he had access and the power to take them home to begin with. And now we're fighting over whether he needs to give them back. So in that sense, like you could say that that's worse because as a senator, Biden did not have the power to take that stuff home at all. And there's a certain intent involved in that, right? You didn't go to a secure location and view these documents in the way that like senators who sit on these committees are supposed to do. You actually took them back to your apartment and then you put them in your garage. So you could say that it's worse from that, but yeah, he didn't define a subpoena to give them back. So, look, I think there's a couple things that you said that just Trump isn't seen as not corrupt. I think even by all but his most dedicated followers, he's not seen as not corrupt. And I think you had a tweet basically to this, or you cited some article a couple days ago on Twitter that basically went to this point. People believe that he's a wrecking ball for a system they believe is fundamentally rigged and corrupt. And Trump's big appeal was at least in 2015, 2016. Yeah, I know the system's corrupt. That's why I haven't paid any taxes. Like I have my army of accountants to avoid paying taxes. Yes, I know that the system's corrupt because I'm the one who plays in it. I've been giving donations to politicians for years and they grant me favors on that basis. So he was very open about what was going in the House. He's like, yeah, I've seen what's going on in the House, in the House of Power behind you. I've seen it because I was part of it, but now I'm going to represent your interests, against this sort of corruption that's already happening. So politically, I don't think this hurts him. The question is, does it hurt the country? And it's obvious to me that it does, because you have now a situation, especially with the bribery charges against Biden and that playing out with Congress and Christopher Wray narrowly avoiding contempt of Congress and so on, in terms of what he's producing about the potential. Now we know about these 17 tapes that exist, right? Potential Biden corruption charges. It's very obvious that what's going to happen is if we have Trump versus Biden, the incentive for each one of them is win or go to jail, right? If Trump wins, he pardons himself and he launches an indictment against Biden. And if Biden wins, this indictment against Trump goes forward and maybe Trump goes to jail. Those are not incentives for, like I said last week, that's not incentives for peaceful transfer of power. It's do or die for both major presidential candidates, assuming they both get the nomination. That is a very serious banana republic problem.
But I think you're conflating sort of the Trump charges, which seem indisputable, and he'll have his day in court. Maybe they're disputable, but they seem very strong and based on an investigation. And the Biden things, which, as far as I can tell, the only evidence for that is what Republicans in Congress are saying. Right. We don't know like how credible the underlying evidence is, unless I've missed something here. We haven't had the FBI say this is very credible and something. They say the source was credible, right? But we don't. There's a lot we don't know here, right?
Well, it's circular though, because the FBI refuses to cooperate with Congress. So we don't know because the FBI is sitting on that information. So this back and forth, basically, first they said the documents don't exist at all. There is no such thing, right? And then when Grassley told them, hey, like, I know this exists. Here's a number of the document because I've seen it. So clearly there's a whistleblower who's given it to him, right? I know the number. I've seen this document, and kind of telling them publicly, like, I know this exists. You can't say it doesn't exist. Then the FBI comes forward and says, okay, yes, it exists. We're going to show it to you, but we're going to show it to you again, to the point about senators not being able to take classified stuff home, right? We're going to show it to you in the SHIF or whatever they call it, right? But they're heavily going to redact it. And now they're fighting over. So now, Grassley comes out and publicly says, okay, there are these 17 tapes. Again, he's telling them, I've seen this document, like, stop screwing with me, right? I've seen this document. I know what it says. I know what the, like, evidence is. Now, the FBI may not have those tapes, right? We don't know if the FBI has those tapes. It's just their existence there's a record in the document of their existence. But yes, I agree. There's a lot we don't know, but I think it's actually quite substantial. What we do know in public is quite substantial. And the reason we don't know more is not because Republicans don't want to share it. It's because the FBI doesn't want to share it.
What does the FBI say? Do they say this is an ongoing investigation?
No, they're saying they're protecting the name of the source, right? So they're protecting the identity of the source in this case. That's their reasoning. Now, maybe that's legitimate, but then, that's what the SHIF and, limited redactions are for. But what Grassley has been saying is you've redacted way too much of this. You're going above and beyond. There's a game being played about how much of this information is actually going to go to the senators, which, again, if we're talking about things to indict Biden on, all of that would go to, for example, that lowest rank of the Espionage Act of willful or reckless disregard of putting classified documents in his garage as a senator when he had potentially no legitimate reason to actually own those documents or have copies of them or physically remove them from the SHIF, right? So it's just, I think there's plenty. I think if a Trump DOJ wanted to go after Joe Biden and indict him, I think there is plenty to do that. And it goes to the question, do we want two people running for president for whom each one, if they win, they get to indict their opponent, and vice versa. If the other one wins, the other, like, that is Banana Republic level crap. And I know that it's all covered over with this LARPy veneer and this sort of Trump show and the fact that he goes and, signs autographs for people outside of, the courtroom or whatever it is. But that doesn't mean that there's something not very, like, disturbing going on here.
Okay. So the saying that Trump was president and Biden, was a senator, to put that distinction, I think, on the same level of clear perjury and obstruction of, look, neither of them, I think the document thing is approximately equal. Neither of them had the right to keep those records. And we don't know it's all presidential daily briefing. I mean, there's other,
I didn't say that, but yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. Okay. So, whatever the documents are, they both get documents. Okay. What is a senator? What is a president? Unless you could show, like, really bad faith on Biden's part, maybe it exists, but, you could imagine how, like, a lot of the stuff is about papers in presidential libraries and, stuff like that. But then the obstruction and the perjury is just so, this is like the clearest case of obstruction or perjury you can imagine, right? And okay, maybe Hillary. Hillary, we could have a longer discussion on that, but Hillary's, in the past, I don't think there's, and the other Biden charges, are still speculative. We still, nobody is, you say the FBI they might have something legitimate there. They might be stalling, maybe, but like
there are only two alternatives. Either Chuck Grassley is lying, right? Maybe he's just straight up lying to the media about what's in these documents, but the things he's saying are so specific that it makes me suspect that he's not lying about it, right? Like, he's not making general assertions. He's saying there are exactly 17 tapes, right? Like, that's a very weird and specific assertion to make if there's nothing behind it, because it's so easily disproven, right? If there isn't anything. So it just, I don't think it's credible to say that there's nothing there. Now, maybe it's not true, right? It's all reliant on this one informer who the FBI has paid as a credible human source or whatever they call it. They have a word for it, right? A confidential human source or whatever it is, that the FBI has paid for a long time. And I'll point out, we already at a much higher standard than opening the investigation during the Russia hoax on Trump. So that's the other comparison.
It just, but okay. So, like, okay, I think it's legitimate the Republicans in Congress, for the Senate, people like Chuck Grassley to press the FBI. When a Republican gets in office, I think it would be legitimate to have a special counsel look into whatever allegations against Biden. That's fine. And then, we can talk about Russiagate, but this is just, and maybe something will come up that's definitive at that point. But this is clear. I mean, this is clear and convincing and like an open and shut case. And you could say, well, theoretically, you could turn your argument around. You say they're all both going to run to be not indicted. Now, you could say that like what the alternative to this would possibly be is like, okay, don't indict Trump because you're afraid you're going to Biden, and then like everyone can just be as corrupt and as screwed up as they want because you're gonna have sort of this quid pro quo. I think the Trump indictment is legitimate, and then if there's an investigation and they show Biden did things that are clearly illegal, there can be an indictment at that point. Why not just say, okay, we have this case here, and then next we'll have the Biden investigation if and when it gets to that, and Congress should do what it wants to do in the meantime.
I mean, it shows how political this is. So I'll say two things. One, I just as an aside, it's probably too long to get into as a separate thing. I do think that Trump has a constitutional argument to make under executive power. But that basically we're going to throw it back to a lot of the questions that were quote unquote resolved around Nixon.
But obstruction and perjury don't depend on the underlying law.
No, but it depends, right? Right. So that's what I said, that actually I think the part of this indictment that I was most worried about is more minor in the actual indictment than I expected it to be. In other words, the things I thought that he would not be able to get around were lying to a grand jury, lying, under oath, right? Sending his lawyers to lie under oath, right? Like that's what I said, like the procedural crimes. It reminded me a lot of like what happened to Mike Flynn, right? Where potentially the entire investigation into him was a bunch of political BS, and they were unlikely to prove the underlying crime. But then in the course of going after him, he made false statements to the FBI, and that's what they ultimately got him for. That's what I kind of expected with this indictment. It also would have been much quicker in terms of getting this to trial, because those, they seem like a lot easier to prove. But there's a lot in this indictment that's directly about the documents, and that's going to take forever. Like what comes in at trial, what doesn't. Like, it's just going to take a very long time to adjudicate all those questions. I don't see this happening before the election, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they're just going to do it at the speed of light for this. But the other is a larger argument that you made about the standard. Like, maybe we should indict all of our former presidents because they're all corrupt, right? Basically, everyone's corrupt, and I think there's a large part of the perjure
clearly obstruct justice. Justice and clearly
but you acknowledge that Hillary is on the same level. You think maybe Joe Biden's one notch below, but there's still some pretty serious stuff he could be indicted on, right? Maybe we just indict everybody. And the reason I would say
everybody, that's just Hillary and Trump, and then with an investigation combined. It's not Obama. It's not George W. We could talk about George W. Bush with the joke crimes, but that's not everybody. That's two people.
I am absolutely certain that you could find a reason to indict Obama if you're looking through I just think that our political class is generally corrupt, and I at least recently, maybe always, but at least recently. I think I think there's still so let me make the argument. So let's just posit that there are at least some number of people at the head of government, or particularly people who are either president or running for president or vice president, at that level, who are corrupt. I still think this norm that we had for 250 years of not prosecuting either former presidents or candidates for the major parties running, right? I think we prosecuted Eugene Debs. But that's okay. So candidates for the major parties who have a shot at winning the election, right? We haven't done that. And the reason is exactly because we don't want to set up this standard where, people have an incentive to cling to power illegitimately, right? If they lose an election, it also means they're going to jail. They don't just stop being president. They are going straight to jail, right? Afterwards. It's very hard to get people out of power once that incentive is established. And so therefore, to me, it's a lesser of two evils, essentially, to say, yeah, there's going to be a higher standard than for Joe Schmo who took a document, home to show to his buddies, than for Trump or for Biden or for Hillary. And that's unfair. And it's not the way we want to think about the law. But I think you have to have something much more serious and much clearer to break that norm, because there's a reason for the norm. And the reason is you provide the worst possible incentives for people to stick in power and never leave. And that's more important. That's more important than getting any of these people on their shady document stuff, to my mind.
You're right. I agree. But it's still up to a point. I mean, I've already said that. Yeah, there's the problem of they can commit crimes. And I think what we had, I think was pretty reasonable, which is there is a higher standard. But I think Trump just blew through it. That's the thing. I think that Trump just blew through it. Could you say if he's running for president? So if he didn't run for president, if he just said I don't want to be president for 2024, I endorse DeSantis. Are we gonna say that that makes it more okay? I think he made it impossible not to do it. I think he really forced it on them once they started investigating for the documents. And look, they started out, just give us the documents. Not National Archives. National Archives is that the deep state conspiracy? They're just the National Archives. The list of sort of conspirators of this deep state has to keep growing. He could have ended this. This is what Chris Christie says. This is what a lot of people said. And he just made it difficult. He really, really made it hard for them. The evidence was overwhelming. And I don't know how you can look at it. If Biden was on tape, doing all this stuff, well, there's a tape of somebody saying that he did. And then he didn't cooperate with the subpoena. And we knew with certainty, and his lawyers were testifying to that effect. That would be different, but he just, it's like you're in a classroom, I don't know if you ever taught kids, and they push you, and you just want to let it go, you don't want to deal with it, but then they push you so far, you have to just sort of do something. I think that's what this case was. I think just Trump's behavior, just in the context of the legal system, was just so obnoxious that he didn't leave them much choice.
I think this really gets down to the essential disagreement that we have. So I think it's exactly the wrong way to think about it, that these are conspirators, right? It's not conspirators. And actually sometimes I object to the way that Trump talks about this for exactly that reason. It's not a cabal of secret people who are gathering to get Trump. It's that these bureaucracies are institutionally, they have policy positions. Most of those policy positions and beliefs of the overwhelming majority of people who work in these bureaucracies, the permanent class of people who are making day-to-day decisions about how the government is run. When everybody says who's running the country, because Joe Biden, is asleep at 4 p.m., right? Who's running the country? Who is it really? Is it the palace intrigue? Is it one of his advisors? No, it's very clearly the bureaucracy. And there's this myth that this bureaucracy does not have a political position. And what's become very, very clear is that entire bureaucracy decided simply the people must not be allowed to elect somebody like Donald Trump, that, for example, has very different positions on foreign policy than we do, that has certain crass elements of him. This guy they've decided that this guy is a huge danger to the country. They decided that back in 2015, which is why they authorized all kinds of illegitimate, spying on a presidential candidate, right? On this obviously wild and unreliable documentation, the Steele dossier. And that's why I brought it up, right? It's not a conspiracy. It's a bunch of people who have very, very similar beliefs, who went to all of the same schools. And Donald Trump was outside of their Overton window. They decided, quite honestly, that he's Hitler, and that therefore any means necessary to get him off the stage is necessary. And it's exactly the wrong, to my mind, exactly the wrong, sort of way to think about it, is the kids who are pushing the adults too far, who really don't want to deal with this, right? It's true that Donald Trump the part of the analogy that's true is that Donald Trump can't seem to help himself. That part is true. He has no self-discipline, no control over himself, no strategy. Like he should know this already about the fact that this entire sort of administrative state has it out for him. They tried to destroy his presidency for 4 years. Okay, he should know that, and therefore he should not act like Donald Trump. But that's the sort of catch-22 of Donald Trump, right? That some of the same qualities that make him successful also make him completely self-destructive. But it's not that these folks are the adults in the room. The DOJ are not the adults in the room. They have a very strong political perspective. And just one piece of evidence to back that up is that in 2016, where there was this huge divide, like between Hillary, who's very much like who they wanted. It's why they didn't want to come after her, right? I think Comey mistakenly thought that he was getting this off the books for her because they were so certain that she was going to win, that they didn't want this investigation ongoing while she was president. Some of the interviews that she had with FBI folks, like it's very clear they don't want to piss her off because they think she's the next president, right? She was very clearly their gal. And the numbers back this up out of donations from federal employees. It's 95-5 in 2016, right? 95% of the political donations from federal employees went to Hillary. And I think it was 99% in the State Department. Okay. Like there's a perspective. These people are political actors, but they're protected unfairly from the buffeting winds of politics by this imaginary idea that the civil service and the administrative state is quote unquote apolitical. And to my mind, this is a crisis of this fourth branch of government that now is more powerful, certainly than Congress, because they can't find, I don't know how much to swear on this podcast, but they can't find their asses with both hands. They haven't been able to actually properly legislate or even pass a real budget in years, right? It's totally like in decline as a branch. And now we have a problem where the executive branch is not controlled by the president in any meaningful sense. And therefore, there's basically no one to oversee these people. They're used to being in power. They're used to making the decisions. And when somebody came in, rightly or wrongly on any given issue, that was totally outside of their Overton window of what they thought that is the right thing to do, they interpret it as a threat that needed to be taken out by any means necessary. So the whole background of this, I think I fundamentally disagree when you laugh about, some of these archivists or whatever, they're not part of a conspiracy, but they are part of a blob where everybody holds the same opinions. And that opinion is Donald Trump is so dangerous that anything must be done to take him out.
So, but like you're conflating a lot of things. So the Russiagate investigation, and then you jump to the National Archives, just asking for documents. Is that like part of their psychology that anything, they must do anything to take him out? I think there could be a lot of things going on here. I think you're right that I think the Russiagate investigation started because they didn't like his views on foreign policy. I think that's correct. And there was a lot of shady things there. I also think there are reasons that like law enforcement might not like Donald Trump, that are legitimate. Like law enforcement tends not to like people who break a lot of laws, for example. And it's possible that Trump is more prone to breaking the law and violating norms than other politicians are. And I think that's part of it. I think that's part of it too. And there might be bad will, based on that, and which wouldn't necessarily mean, bad will towards all Republicans or all conservatives. I think, there's this great article, by Iglesias called, The Orange Man is Bad. And I love this quote. So I don't do this much, but I'm going to read this. And he says about Trump, his con is not that he's convinced conservatives that he's honest. It's that he's convinced conservatives that his lying and shamelessness is a superpower that he deploys on behalf of their issues and causes. And that it's true that he has at times deployed dishonesty and shamelessness to advance conservative causes. But much more frequently, he deploys dishonesty and shamelessness to advance himself, often at the expense of conservative causes. And I think that, I think this really gets at something. I think Trump has done a great job of making conservatives think they're coming after you. Like the FBI just hates you. Like everyone is just coming after you and they hate me because I am your representative. And a lot of it is it's just him. It's just literally him. You can have someone with the exact same political positions. If he's the kind of guy who cooperates with law enforcement and doesn't take documents home, like, and is so desperate to like show off his, to Kim Jong Un, doesn't like chant lock him, like, okay, like the fact that, they chant lock him up at rallies, or lock her up, like whenever Trump like mentions someone they don't like this is like a sort of a like bad, like norm breaking thing. And I could see how like this could cause bad will. So I think there are like a lot of legitimate reasons to think Trump is uniquely bad. And there will be a reaction to that. Yes. And maybe they will sometimes be unfair to Trump. But this is not, there's a part of this that is not conservatism, or this is not right wing. It's just literally this man. And he benefits when like conservatives adopt the cause, his cause as their own, because they're not the same cause.
So I agree with what you read. Was that from Iglesias? Right? Mm-hmm. About that sometimes the Trump's lodestar is really himself. Maybe he is the sort of narcissistic avatar that Boomer America deserves, even though he's a little older than the Boomer generation even. I very much dislike this about Trump. I've always disliked it about Trump. And I think he showed that in spades after the election of 2020. Just to give one potential example, right, Andrew Jackson, there's been a couple allegations of essentially stealing elections in American history. Andrew Jackson, in his initial election, I can never remember if it's 24 or 28, but anyway, in his initial election, he thinks the election is stolen. He has pretty good reason to think that, because there's some wheeling and dealing. This is where the House still like votes, and anyways, I'm not going to go into all that, but anyway, he has a pretty good reason for thinking so. And what he does is basically say, well, I'll be back in 4 years, even stronger. I'm holding, and I'm going to come for the corrupt sort of Washington wheelers and dealers. And he comes back in 4 years and he wins. It's the same thing that Nixon did, right? There's some evidence, historical evidence, that Joe Kennedy sold the election on behalf for his son, right? By stuffing ballot boxes and all the rest. But these were adults. And Nixon says, no, it's bad for the country. I'm just going to come back and run again. Right? Like, I'm going to accept this, even though I don't believe. So this is even if you do it, like, we assume that Trump is sincere in his saying that he thinks he won the election. Right? And you see that really negative impulse in Trump come out after the election, where he doesn't care about anything other than whoever has personally screwed him. Right? So that I agree. But on the flip side, right, the FBI is coming for you through Trump. Okay, the FBI is also issuing memos about parents who are concerned about what their children are learning in school as domestic terrorists, to treat them as potential domestic terrorists, right? And that even before the Trump era, you go back to my favorite scandal to keep repeating, because there's this idiotic meme that there were no scandals under the Obama administration, where you have the IRS targeting their political opponents, not, people like Trump, but ordinary people who are organizing in little Tea Party, groups across America, where the FBI, is coming after parents now, and the IRS, which in many cases is scarier to the average American, right, comes after like individual Tea Party groups and like some little old lady who is the chair. And nothing happens to Lois Lerner over this, right? She sits in front of Congress, she basically says nothing, and then she rides off into the sunset. So I think both things can be true. Trump is a petulant sort of narcissist who sees everything through the lens of, who's insulted him on TV last. And it's also true that we have this malignant sort of permanent state that is bringing us into a constitutional crisis repeatedly now, because they can't accept that just the people just like this idiot, Donald Trump, and they want him to be president for 4 or 8 years. And they can't accept this. They just can't accept it. They're going to bring down much more important norms to make sure that this doesn't happen. And by the way, you said about, you can see why they don't like Trump, because he's going around rallies, back in 2016 saying, lock her up, right? They actually are trying to lock him up. So who's showing more? Literally, they have less self-restraint and concern about the norms of the republic than Donald Trump, because he decided, after all of that, not to lock her up. He made some statement about how it would be bad for the country. So even this narcissist understood that, and they don't. The supposedly adults in the room don't understand that.
Okay, so Inez, I think I think what you were so, I think you're reaching when you're trying to say they're coming for you. First of all, you said the FBI. You have to find, okay, so like you said, you have to find something where the FBI is going after Republicans or conservatives who are not Trump. And you say they wrote a letter saying parents are domestic terrorists. That was, first of all, that was the DOJ. I mean, it was just a letter. It wasn't a single prosecution. DOJ, I'm sure, produces thousands and thousands of documents. It's not good. It's not good that they did that, but nobody been investigated as far as I know. Nobody's been locked up. The Republicans in Congress seized one letter, and it's bad. It's Biden's DOJ. Okay. But like, where's the evidence that the FBI, which had a director, Comey, who was appointed by Bush, and then the next director was appointed by Trump himself. Where's the evidence that the FBI? We could say the IRS, that we jump to the Lois Lerner, right? The Tea Party era scandal. Where's the evidence that the FBI has it out for conservatives, not Trump, but conservatives in general?
You are too smart to make this argument that because they're appointed by Republicans, that they're not part of, because
it's a data point.
This is something that maybe is just part of being in DC or whatever, but you do very quickly learn the enormous power of bureaucracy, and that the people that are sort of have the right resume in that system, they may be appointed by Republicans or Democrats, they may vote Republican or Democrat, but they have a very particular institutional view, and that's exactly what I'm talking about, that this institutional power is out of control in a way that doesn't just affect Trump, although maybe he thumbs his nose at it in a stupid way. But that's not about Trump, right? And by the way, I do think, on one hand, I think it's not a really legit argument to launch against DeSantis supporters, right? But people say, basically, they're going to come after DeSantis in the same way, right? Anyone who does anything serious about the institutional power of the left, they're going to come after in this same way. I actually think that's true. In other words, okay. I think it'd be harder to do with somebody like DeSantis because he's more careful, which I think is a positive for DeSantis. But I think they are looking for a way to do any Republican who's not in that sort of bipartisan lane. I think what's happened largely is this entire blob in Washington, D.C. has decided that the policy norms of more or less the last 30 years, right? So post-Reagan, from George H.W. Bush through 2016, they've decided that the bipartisan norms, and I'm not going to say they're crazy left-wing. They're not crazy left-wing. They're exactly in that very narrow spectrum from, sort of conservative left to, liberal Republican, right? They've decided that the boundaries of discourse need to be that, and anything outside of that is a threat to liberal democracy. Okay? They've confused their own policy ossification of the last 30 years with some kind of existential threat. And in the course of doing so, they are doing things that are actually bringing us into a constitutional crisis. We will be in a constitutional crisis if Donald Trump wins from jail. We will be in a constitutional crisis if he pardons himself after this indictment and then launches an indictment of ex-President Biden. Okay, we will be in a constitutional crisis that will be by then far beyond what either Trump or Biden or anyone else can control, in the same way that eliminating the 60 vote threshold for judicial nominations was inevitably going to end up with both sides using it, right? This is the ironclad rule of politics. And I agree that Trump is not, I didn't like him in 2015. I didn't like him in 2016. I thought his presidency was better than I could have had the right to expect, given my assessment of who he was in terms of a conservative. He delivered more things that I would like than I expected him to, but I'm certainly I voted for him in 2020. And I will vote for him again if he becomes the Republican nominee in 2024. I prefer he's not, because I just don't see in him the sort of strategic what's necessary to actually fight this kind of institutional power in a serious way that's not just kicking. I see Donald Trump as basically kicking the hornet's nest and then leaving us all to deal with the bees, but that being said, I think the greater danger here by far, and the only people breaking really serious norms, is this blob, and not even quote unquote Democrats or Joe Biden. It's this Washington blob a lot of which have their positions basically for life. They're permanent.
You are, yeah. So I mean, let me go back, because I think that you're just grouping sort of everything, and I think there's a spectrum here. And I'm glad you said that you think if DeSantis uh, came to power and actually affected change, they would prosecute him in the same way, because I don't believe that. So that's like a disagreement that maybe one day will be adjudicated by reality. One day we'll have a president other than Trump. I don't think, like, I don't see them like, yeah, I don't believe that. I think this is more about, this is a fundamental disagreement. I think this is less about ideology, and I will make one exception for foreign policy. I think in foreign policy there is a sort of deep state bipartisan consensus about what we should do. But in the world of sort of like, I don't know, civil rights law or taxation, like, I don't think DeSantis comes to power and does right wing things on those things. The bureaucracy just tries to get him off or something. It's not like the EEOC is like, because the bureaucracy is different. It's different people, right? Like, there's some far left wingers and there's more moderate, I think, reasonable people in law enforcement. But let me go. I mean, could be, but so I sort of resist this tendency to just say it's all the blob, because Trump makes specific allegations about the FBI. Now we can stick to the FBI, because there's not, until Trump came along, and maybe they are prejudiced against Trump, but there was never sort of, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm forgetting something, idea that they were particularly geared towards derailing Republican efforts or conservatives. Like that wasn't something people thought in 2015. Maybe they thought the IRS was a bunch of liberals. They just want to collect everyone's taxes. Okay. That sort of makes more sense. But what about the theory that just the FBI is maybe anti-Trump and maybe not anti-conservative and maybe not anti-Republican to any great extent, unless they're anti-interventionists?
So I think it's pretty clear they are by the way that they treated these allegations. I think that they've jettisoned their professional code in favor of this because they just can't stand Donald Trump. Like, I think they would behave this way with Bush? No. Which is why I used the DeSantis example. I actually think they probably got along relatively well with Bush.
What do you think they like? What do you think they like about Bush that they wouldn't like about DeSantis? What's the difference between those two?
I think essentially it's whether it breaks this consensus of, like, let's say 1998, what both parties might basically be able to agree on. So they're willing to tolerate a little few moves right on certain things or a few moves left on certain things, certain policies. By the way, I think you'll find, if we do discover this, I think you'll find the exact opposite on the issue that you care about in terms of the Civil Rights Act. I think you would have mass bureaucratic revolt over that. So, for example,
I agree with that. I don't think in the FBI. I don't think in the FBI though. But yeah, go ahead.
It took 3 years. One of the things that I sort of had a small hand in as an outside person. I never worked for the Department of Education for good reason. But just to reassert the federal court upheld definition of due process and harassment. Okay. So just to reaffirm what federal courts and the Supreme Court have defined as the constitutional necessities under which a bunch of young men are able to have been winning cases against universities for denying them their constitutionally protected rights, due process, and engaging in an unconstitutionally broad definition of harassment that sweeps in protected speech. Okay, just to promulgate regulations that do that, the bare minimum, and all power to them, which I will always praise. This particular, there's other aspects of DeVos's tenure at the Department of Ed that I totally disagree with, but I think that they did a really good job actually promulgating these regulations under the APA. Like, they did the whole folderol, they went through the whole procedure to get this on the books. You know how long it took them? I think almost 3 years. Why? It's not because it's difficult. It's not because it's so difficult to do it. It's because literally every step of the way they're fighting their own people. This is the reality of being, quote unquote, an actual conservative in the federal bureaucracy. Is that, like, you're and you think the FBI is fundamentally different than that?
I think that the FBI is different than the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education. Yes, I mean, I do. I think that there's a sort of a spectrum, and because I was talking about, does the FBI prosecute conservatives, right? And you went to the Office of Civil Rights, Department of Education, slow walks, civil rights.
Well, that was in response to
conservative.
what you said about civil rights. Like,
Yeah, but we were talking about, but I was talking about it in the context of the FBI and why they hate dissent, right? They would hate, in your mind, DeSantis more than Bush, right? So what I'm trying to get at is like they would try to charge DeSantis with a declassified document, classified documents kind of thing, because they got mad that he got rid of Title IX rape tribunals. Is that how the FBI works? Because like there's this thing called the Blob, but there's like the federal judiciary, and there's the FBI, and there's civil rights people, and there's the DOJ, and there's the political appointees, and then the non-political appointees. I think there's like a lot of different things here, and just to say they're all the Blob and they're all against us and they're all against conservatives, I think that's painting with too broad of a brush.
I mean, so to some extent, that's obviously true, right? So there are different hiring rules for like federal prosecutors, for example, than there are for like typical civil servant bureaucrats. But I think that their overall behavior under the Trump administration exactly proves how much those professional codes have degenerated over time. And we can have a conversation about wokeness, for example, and how each new rank and what's happening in the law schools, right? And how each new rank of people hired in the DOJ and the FBI are coming out of places like Stanford Law that now can't listen to, federal Judge Duncan give a completely like bland legal talk, right? I think that the entrance of that kind of activism, and you might say this is again like some side point, I don't think it is, right? The entrance of that kind of activism is already more than like, let's say, a decade old, and it's transforming these institutions. So maybe 30 years ago, there was a code in the FBI that was fundamentally apolitical. And if you listen to, for example, somebody like Andy McCarthy, who I had on my podcast and specifically asked him about this, somebody like Andy McCarthy, he goes back when he was working in the 90s as a prosecutor for some very important cases, including the Blind Shake case, right? And he actually gave me an example of working on Whitewater, right? Most people don't remember this scandal, but like this was a Clinton scandal about potentially like, I don't even remember, but it was about like, basically she had invested in certain stocks that did like really, really well after the fact. And there was some question as to whether that this was basically corruption, and I can't remember the details of it. But the FBI was investigating it. And he said he was working with a Democratic prosecutor, and he was the Republican. And actually, at the end of the case, right, he thought there was not enough evidence to charge the case of the Democrat, right, the Democratic scandal. And the Democrat prosecutor thought there was enough evidence to charge the case, right? And he gave me this example is there used to be this professional code, right? We have our political views. Now, I think there's probably a certain inevitability to that kind of code breaking down anyway, but let's leave that aside. Right? That is no longer true. It's no longer true in the FBI. Andy McCarthy admits that it's no longer true in the DOJ or the FBI. And he's shocked by their behavior in the last 4 years for that reason. It's the kind of behavior that would be absolutely unacceptable as a matter of professionalism when he was working there. And that's part of the reason I was asking him about this, because I think it's really interesting and goes to the point, right? He was shocked by what happened under Trump. And a lot of the reason that he was reluctant to get out ahead of what was happening, and he was kind of always saying, well, we got to take this seriously, or this drip or that drip about, the Mueller investigation and all that stuff. Part of the reason that he would take it seriously each time is like, he can't believe that the FBI would behave, or the DOJ, I'm confusing them now, but, would behave, in this way. As a former prosecutor saying, like, we used to have professional standards. I can't believe that this is so rampant in the FBI. Like, yeah, you might have one bad boss or one bad like agent, but to have, this kind of rampant politicization, is unbelievable. But now he has to look back and say all that happened. And I think it is because the same thing that happened to the New York Times, right? Between, 1990 and 2 years ago, the same thing has happened to a lot of these law enforcement apparatus. And of course, it's much more dangerous when it happens in the DOJ than when it happens in the New York Times, as dangerous as that is.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot we can get about society and about the sort of different parts of government. And we only have a few minutes left though, and we wanted to get a bunch of different topics. But I think just we'll just spend a few minutes on. There's this Josh Barrow piece that I'll link to. It goes, "It's time for GOP candidates to pile on Trump," and this is about Chris Christie. Chris Christie recently had a CNN town hall, got pretty good reviews from what I saw on Twitter. I've tweeted some videos out. And I actually saw a poll that in New Hampshire, where Trump was like, some ridiculously high number, 50% or 40% or something. DeSantis was 12. Christie was 7. This is one poll, but I mean, Christie being within 5 points of DeSantis, and I think Tim Scott might have been like at 7 too. In any state, I think is, quite remarkable. And I think this sort of validates sort of what I've been saying, and Josh Barrow makes this argument too, that they're going to have to go at Trump. There is no just like hoping he implodes. I mean, when you say, the liberals are hoping he just sort of goes away or his voters disappear, I think that's what Republicans think is going to happen. And it hasn't happened since 2015. It certainly doesn't look like it's starting to happen now. So is this just like, is there just a realization, coming to maybe all the other campaigns and all the pundits that, yeah, you're going to actually have to fight Trump to win this nomination?
Yeah, you would think at some point that if you're running against a guy, you're going to have to actually say that he did a bad job on some particular thing. Now, does that mean he did a bad job on everything? Obviously, you're running against the incumbent president, even though with a 4-year gap in between, which hasn't happened since Cleveland. But if he were to win, I mean, no, I mean, I think at some point about this, I think Christie is right. Like at some point, you're going to have to actually directly attack the guy. And there was some quote in there where he was basically during this town hall. Christie was saying, you can't just say it's time for younger leadership. It's time for a new direction. Like all these sort of corporate bland phrases. Like you're running against the guy. Give us the case why you're a better pick than he is. Right? You actually have to make that case. You can't just pretend that you're not running against this person that you're in the race allegedly against. Now that's complicated by the fact that a lot of people are clearly running for the VP slot, which is just, in my view, is kind of pathetic. Just don't run for president. I mean, I know there's all those incentives. There's like, all you need is one billionaire and an ego.
Why not run for VP?
I mean, but it's just very cringy to me to see somebody on the stage and then just so obsequious to your primary opponent. Like it just begs the question: why are you in the race?
Who are you talking about, Inez? Is there somebody you think you expect to be particularly obsequious to Trump in the debate?
I think Haley, Scott, and to some extent Vivek Ramaswamy, who I like better than either of those two, have come out as sort of so obsequious to Trump, and that it begs the question why they're running against them and why they think they're better. And mostly what you get from them are answers like, "Well, I'm younger than Trump." Well, that might work with Biden because he seems like he's ready for the pudding line, but Trump is pretty vigorous for his age. He doesn't seem to have lost his mental faculties. He's sort of physically robust. I don't think those arguments land the same way as they do with Biden, where everyone is pretty sure that, he's not actually, as we talked about earlier, running the presidency, that he's not capable of it. Even his own voters, even Democratic voters, in polls say that they're worried about his age. Trump doesn't have that. And I just don't think it's a strong enough argument as to why you're in the race against an incumbent president of your own party. And so there's a cringe factor involved in that. Look, DeSantis has sort of, until like a couple weeks ago, kind of fell in that category too, where he was like avoiding actually attacking Trump. Either get in or get out. Tell me why you're better. Tell me why you're better than the current front runner. And if you can't do that, there's a certain so in that case, I agree with Christie. The reason no one is doing it, though, is that the lane to actually be anti-Trump in the Republican Party is about this wide. There might be people who are open to somebody like DeSantis, but they're not open because they dislike Trump. So it's just kind of a catch-22 for anybody running against Trump in the Republican primary.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll just say, I think there's a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, this kind of thing. Yeah, it's very narrow. Like, it seems like everyone likes Trump, but, it's sort of in part because no one's arguing against Trump. So in that case, like, of course, like it's not going to be, there's not going to be an audience for anti-Trump arguments. So you have to make the arguments and you have to sort of change reality. When Trump came on the scene, he had, I think he actually had negatives, pretty high negatives with Republican voters, but, he won them over. So, I mean, this is sort of what you have to do in politics. Well, this is fun, Inez. I think we got some real disagreements, and I'll see you again next week.